Hey everybody, welcome back, and I hope that you are enjoying this month's focus on service. If you joined us last week, then you know that we talked about the ways that we can do good in the world by doing small things with great love. If you're on my email list, then you also received an email about the ways in which the 4 core practices interrelate with one another. We also talked a little bit about burnout. And if you're on my email list, you received an email talking about self-care. I really encourage you to join the email list if you're interested in receiving inspirational emails between videos. I'll leave a link in the description box to my email list as well as this month's calendar, which features daily prompts for how to practice service. This week, I'd like to draw our attention to selfless service. And you might argue that it's impossible for humans to be selfless when they serve. Evolutionary biologists, for instance, have long made the argument that humankind is in it for themselves. And it is in it for themselves in order to propagate the species and ensure that the survival of the fittest continues. However, there have been research studies that show that there is a kind of willingness to self-sacrifice amongst animals within kinship circles. You might argue that that still is about propagating, if not the species, at least that kinship line. But further research has indicated that there are animals that hunt together despite being predators of one another. And there may be some evidence that there is a case for cooperation instead of competition, even in the animal world. Well, then we draw our attention to the human animal. Is it possible for us to be selfless? Are we capable of giving without personal gain? Well, again, we turn to research, and research shows that those who give out of a sense of financial gain or reputational gain are not likely to give again. It is not a sustainable form of giving. On the other hand, those who give out of a sense of generosity within themselves continue to do so. That is one form of sustainable giving. So in terms of long-term giving, it is not possible to give and be self-interested. It won't last over the long term. So, is it possible for humans to be generous? Well, neuroscience and psychology offers us some answers. We are all born with a certain level of generosity. It's our trait level. And research shows that generosity is linked to certain factors in the Big Five personality test. Both neuroscience and psychology research shows us, however, that we can develop our state level of generosity. Neuroscience shows us that when we do good, we release a cocktail of feel-good hormones in the brain, and so it literally feels good to do good. And that's one motivation to be generous. But we can also develop our generosity if we develop our personality trait of empathy. Empathy is the ability to put ourselves in the other person's shoes and to see the world through their perspective. So there's two kinds of empathy. There is cognitive empathy, where we mentally understand how a person might feel in a certain circumstance. But there is also emotional empathy, where we feel the way the other person feels. Both forms of empathy take us out of our ego. By definition, ego in this sense is the Eastern philosophy definition of ego. That part of ourselves that sees the world in a certain way and that believes that that is the sum total of who we are. When we're taken out of ourselves and we place ourselves in the position of another person, we diminish our own ego. And by diminishing our ego, we become selfless. Empathy taken to the extreme can become overwhelming, and at that point we move into compassion, which is the desire to alleviate another person's suffering through action. And so empathy, which leads to compassion, leads to altruism. And because empathy leads us out of ourselves, it takes us into a kind of selfless altruism. So it seems that the key to becoming selfless in our service is to diminish the effect of our ego, to diminish our attachment to outcome, to diminish our wish to have any kind of financial or reputational gain through giving. If you're part of a faith-based tradition, then I encourage you to work within that tradition to limit that sense of grandiosity of self. But if you are part of the secular majority, then one of the greatest ways to diminish that ego is through empathy and compassion. Empathy, like any other personality trait, is something that we are born with. And we're born with a certain level of it, but we can develop it through practices. We're going to spend an entire month on the practice of empathy later on in the year. Well, why is it important, you might ask, that our service be selfless? And I was asked this question by a dear friend who often plays devil's advocate to get me to think through these practices a little bit deeper. And I would say there's 3 practical reasons that I can give you. The first reason goes back to the start, and that is that any altruism that is motivated by self-interest is not sustainable. And so being selfless is good for the whole. And the second reason that we also have already touched on is that doing good out of a sense of generosity releases a feel-good cocktail in the brain, and that feeling good for doing good is what makes it beneficial to the individual. And finally, if our altruism is motivated out of a sense of generosity and out of empathy in particular, we're able to put ourselves in the other person's shoes and we do what they need rather than what we think is best. When we give without ego, it benefits the receiver. So finally, we come back to the age-old argument that if we actually benefit, if we feel good for doing good, can it ever really be selfless? Well, I don't mean to insult my audience, but I'd venture to say that most of us are not enlightened beings. We're not the Bodhisattva who was given the choice to release himself of the circle of karma and be enlightened and released from earth, or to stay here and be forever on the karmic wheel in order to bring the rest of humanity to enlightenment. I don't know about you, but I'm not that. I'm just a mere mortal. And so I think most of us enjoy doing good because it feels good. But here's the thing, on a practical level, when we do good, we're putting good into the world. And research shows that while people may judge others for doing good in order to benefit their reputation or for some financial or career gain, there is no judgment of anyone who actually feels good and may give in order to have that hormone cocktail. So practically speaking, if we're putting good into the world and we're not taking anything out of it, then we get a net gain in the world. I hope that this week you will try to find ways to be a little bit more selfless, to diminish the ego, and to do things just for the sake of doing them. Doing things just for the sake of doing them also entails, of course, releasing our attachment to the outcome. And that becomes particularly important when sometimes we do something good for someone and they're not grateful. And there comes the true test of why we're giving. For what are you most grateful today?